There we go. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and spotlight for everyone our wonderful presenter. All right, so I want to tell you a little bit about Jennifer Caplan. So she is from the Cincinnati. She's joining us from the lovely state of Ohio. And she is the Jewish Foundation of Cincinnati Chair in Judaic Studies at the University of Cincinnati. And she's also the author of a couple of other publications. She has written Judaism and Popular Culture and on Judaism and Popular Culture, including Bulletin for the Study of Religion, Journal of Modern Jewish Studies, Shofar, and the Journal of Jewish Identities. So she has lots of things to her credit. And she's going to talk to us about her new book, Funny, You Don't Look Funny, which I just love that title. And she pointed out some fun things to me. I didn't even notice because I was too busy with all these other things, but she has this great cover that does double duty. I don't know. She pointed out to me how this comma in funny also acts as the apostrophe and don't, which I love that idea of a double entendre there. What a great thing for a comedy topic about Judaism and humor from the silent generation to millennials. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jennifer. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Hillary. I'm so thrilled to be here with you all. I'm very excited to be able to do this. Hillary and I had talked a little bit before we got started. So feel free as I'm talking to use the chat feature if you think of a question. A, so that you don't forget it later, and B, because if I see it pop up while I'm talking, it might be something that I can interact with right then. But also when we get to the Q&A portion, we're a nice tight group of 15 people, so feel free to just unmute, ask questions, jump in, and you can in fact even use there's a little raise your hand option. So if you have a question or a comment while I'm talking, feel free to interrupt me, and I will try to keep my eye on that. I always tell my students I'm happy to be interrupted if the spirit moves you to need to ask something or say something. So what I thought I would do this evening is I just wanted to talk a little bit about how I came to this project and why I decided to write this book. And then I thought I would read to you the first few pages of the introduction to give you a little bit of the flavor of the book and the sense of it. And then I can talk a little bit about what the rest of the book contains. And then we'll just have free-for-all Q&A discussion for the rest of the time. And all of you can tell me your favorite Jewish joke or something. We can go around and share. So this is my first book, and as is the case with most academic first books, that means it is based on my dissertation from my PhD, although this bears less of a resemblance to my dissertation than a lot of people's first books do. I entirely reconfigured, rethought, restructured the entire thing and added new material for the book that as it exists now. But I grew up surrounded by the classic Jewish humor of the 1930s to 1970s. My dad was an actor, is an actor and director. In fact, he is a graduate of Ringling Brothers Clown College in Sarasota, Florida. I like to say that my dad is the only person I know who dodged the Vietnam draft by being in clown college instead of regular college. Although in fact, he didn't go to clown college until after he dropped out of the University of Akron. So it's not entirely true. But so I grew up surrounded by classic figures in Jewish humor and with a really deep appreciation for comedy as serious work and hard work. And I saw how much effort went into the craft of comedy. And so as I progressed through my academic career, I was a double major in college. I went to Wellesley College in Massachusetts, and I was a double major in religious studies and theater studies. So I sort of got into the overlap between my two majors, and I started really thinking about religious themes in literature and theater and popular culture and American life. And that led me to my master's degree at Harvard Divinity School, where I continued working primarily in American religion and popular culture. Weirdly, I did a lot of work on Jesus when I was at Harvard. Big project on Jesus and theater, musical theater. And then I left school for a while, and I worked at an independent bookstore down in Ohio, and I taught at a community college. And I kind of bounced around and did a few things. And when I decided to go back and get my PhD, and it came time to think about my dissertation topic, I kept coming back to the idea that people didn't take comedy seriously enough. And the point where I needed to start writing my dissertation lined up with the big Pew Foundation Portrait of American Jews that they released in 2013, late 2012, early 2013. And on that survey, one of the questions that they asked people is, what's essential for a Jewish life? And in the results, they found almost identical statistical responses to people who said that an interest in the state of Israel is essential to a Jewish life, and people who said a sense of humor is essential to a Jewish life. And that just sort of set off all sorts of neurons firing in my mind. And I really started to think about the fact that we, at that point, we're sort of 30 years into all of the rhetoric about the evils of cultural Judaism. And it had been going on since the 1990 National Jewish Population Study, which is the first one that showed intermarriage approaching 50%. And it was the point at which people really started to panic about the idea that American Judaism was imperiled. And it was imperiled as far as they could tell, and by they, I mean the statisticians, it was imperiled because intermarriage was very high, and corresponding, especially among younger Jews, synagogue membership, JCC membership, ritual observance, these things were all down. And that, to folks, really signaled that American Judaism was on the precipice of death, because if half of American Jewish families are now interfaith, and if interfaith families are less likely to raise their children Jewish, and we're losing all of these Jewish touchstones, then where are we going to be? We're one generation away from death. But by the time I got to writing my dissertation, that narrative was 25 years old, and no one, we hadn't died yet. And in fact, numbers were stable. The intermarriage rate was staying the same, but so was the Jewish population. And engagement, the way that they were measuring engagement was still going down. But what I saw from that Pew data, and what I felt when I started to do this research, was that perhaps we're asking the questions the wrong way. And when we're trying to get a handle on how people think about what it is to do a Jewish act, we are perhaps giving them limited options to respond to these surveys. So if the same percentage of Jews feel like a connection to Israel is essential to a Jewish identity as a sense of humor, then perhaps for some Jews, engagement with humor, especially Jewish humor, is something that they're doing as Jews, not just as people, not just as people who like humor, but this is a Jewish act to them. And so that's really what I tried to get at with the book. And this is part of why this is the first book on Jewish humor that really approaches it from a religious studies perspective, and is trying to look at the way that these humorists engage with Judaism, the way they use Jewish rituals and Jewish texts and rabbis and explicit Jewish identity. So it's really focused on the engagement between comedy and religion, and it's trying to make a space for rethinking what counts as engaging with Jewish life, what counts as having an active Jewish identity. And I really think that the more that we can be responsive to what we see happening, the less dire the situation looks in terms of the American Jewish population and American Jewish identity. So that was sort of the origins for the book. That's where I came to it, how I kind of came to the topic. So now, if you'll permit me, I wanted to read you just a little bit of the introduction to give you a sense of it. I was really hoping that my press was going to approach me to record an audiobook of it, and they haven't yet, but hope springs eternal. And so I'm still holding on to the hope that someday I'm going to get to be an audiobook reader and I'll get to narrate my own book here. But the wise men went to that country. The wise man made up his mind that he had to know the essence of the country. And how could he know the essence of the country? By the country's jokes. Because when one has to know something, one should know the jokes related to it. Nachman of Bratslav. Jews and humor seem to go together like peas and carrots, like peanut butter and jelly, like Burns and Allen. Perhaps it has always been that way, though, as I will discuss in the pages to come, I don't think so. Somewhere along the line, along their long and winding road, Jews got funny. Not just in an ontological sense, but in a way that was noticeable from the outside and was a point of pride from the inside. So while this relationship did not appear suddenly, when Time magazine published its now famous 1978 article, Behavior, Analyzing Jewish Comics, which claimed, among other things, that 80% of the working comedians in America were Jewish, despite Jews being then 3% of the general population, it both came as a shock and confirmed something people had long suspected. In the wake of that article, Jewish humor became something people wanted to study, but that's a tricky thing to do. First, what makes humor Jewish? Well, Sigmund Freud asked this question back in 1905, and nearly a century later, Rabbi Joseph Telushkin was still asking the same thing. Does a joke have to be by Jews and for Jews in order to qualify? This is Freud's view. Telushkin, on the other hand, thought that a qualifying joke just needs Jewish sensibilities. Both of these definitions are so broad in different directions that it begs the question as to what the term Jewish humor even means anymore. This book is not going to answer that question. I remain unconvinced that any book can answer it with finality. What this book is going to do, however, will bear on the question. It will chart the relationship between humor created by Jews and Judaism. My reason for approaching the question in this way are many, but primarily I see great value in zeroing in on the ways in which Jewish humorists have engaged Jewish practices and their own Jewishness. It tells us something, or perhaps it tells us many somethings, about the relationship between Jews and humor that goes deeper than the mere coincidence that a certain humorist was born into a certain family. In order to make sense of this book will also focus on change over time. I isolate 4 sequential generations as classified by sociologists. The silent generation, born roughly 1925 to 1945. The baby boom, born between 1946 and 1965. Generation X, born from 1966 to 1979. And Millennials, born from 1980 to 1995. Taking examples of humor from each generation that are about Jewish things, including rituals, texts, and Jewishness itself, I'll track the way each generation's relationship to these Jewish elements changes. I hope that this methodology will illuminate some of the meaning behind the phrase Jewish humor, while simultaneously showing why it may be impossible to define that in a stable way. If something is changing significantly every 20 years or so, no wonder we would have a hard time getting a handle on it. We have to zoom out far enough to recognize that those changes are happening. These generations are, at their core, useful fictions. There is some statistical truth to the increase in the birth rate after World War II that gave rise to the baby boom moniker, but why the baby boom is said to end in, say, 1965, when the birth rate had been declining since 1958, is mostly arbitrary. The generational conceit of the book may seem similarly arbitrary. An account of this kind could be chronological or separated by media type. But there's an important story happening along the generational lines. Traditionally, sociologists and historians have classified American Jews into generational categories based on distance from immigration that cut across those used to describe the population as a whole. The humorists I identify as being part of the silent generation were mostly part of what has traditionally been called the second generation within American Jewish history. I don't know if any of these humorists would have called themselves second generation, but I'm nearly certain none of them would have ever identified as silent generation. That lack of a conscious connection to the generation into which sociologists categorized you started to change, however, with the baby boom generation. And that change is part of this story. Some baby boomers may also think of themselves as second or third generation Americans, but they also think of themselves as baby boomers. And if you ask many of them what generation they're part of, if they have an answer, it's likely the baby boom. By the time you get to Generation X, American Jews had lost any real sense of the particularly Jewish generational difference. American Jewish members of Gen X, if asked their generation, will tell you they're Gen X. And moreover, that began to matter to American Jews. This book chronicles evidence of a changing relationship between American Jews and their conception of Jewishness, and the move from identifying with internal Jewish generations to strongly identifying with American cultural generations. This is an important data point. If you mistakenly call an American Jew born in 1979 a millennial, she will likely correct you and in no uncertain terms remind you that she is Gen X. This book argues that what we see from the way humorists engage with Jewish things in their humor is a shift from prioritizing Jewish peoplehood to protecting Judaism. In this case, the simultaneous shift from identifying in a communal Jewish way to a cross-cultural American way is not arbitrary at all. It is the heart of the issue. I'm framing much of this priority shift in terms of whether or not the comedy of an era is treating Judaism as a thing with a capital T. Thing in this context is more than just a vague identifier. Using Bill Brown's thing theory, I argue the word to mean something broken, abandoned, or no longer useful. In Brown's terms, the same object can be simultaneously a thing and an object. A non-functional car, for example, is a thing to the person who now needs to go buy a new car, but it may be a very useful object to the visual artist responsible for Carhenge. In applying this theory to Judaism, I'm probing whether humorists present Judaism as something vital and useful or dead and dysfunctional. The relationship of immigrant Jews to their religion has been analyzed extensively. See Hasia Diner, Nathan Glazer, Jonathan Sarna, Jack Wertheimer, for example. But my argument is that the children and grandchildren of the turn of the century immigrants, the members of the silent generation, began a process of thingifying Judaism that their baby boomer children continued. That in and of itself may not be a terribly interesting argument. What was unexpected, and therefore much more interesting, is that Gen X pushed back against this thingification and began to resacralize certain elements in their humor while profaning others. The thingification of Judaism seems to be extremely important to the silent generation and disappears almost entirely by the 21st century. The full story of millennial humor is yet to be written, as many of this generation are still building their careers, but we can nevertheless draw some conclusions as to whether they are continuing the trends begun by Gen X or changing the relationship between humor and Jewishness yet again. These generations must exist in pairs as well, because the humor with which young people grow up and the popular media they consume, that's what helps shape their sense of self. And that's what the previous generation has been producing. So there's always a trickle-down effect from one generation to the next. What this research shows, therefore, is that as these generations become more attached to their secular generational identity, they also become more interested in normalizing Jewish ritual practice and individual Jewish identities. Because I'm focusing on humor that has some social or religious target, most of what will be included in this study could be classified as satire. Not all humor is satiric, And not all satire is humorous, although the latter is a bit closer to being true. My definition of satire aligns with that of Ziva Ben-Porat, who says that satire is a critical representation, always comic, often caricatural. Freud argued that meaningful jokes must have a purpose, although the underlying impetus for joking may well be latent or subconscious, and satiric humor clearly satisfies that requirement. My operating definition of Jewish satire relies on the notion of purpose. Satire must be anchored in reality because it is the real world, or in this case, real Judaism or real Jews, that are being satirized. What constitutes real, however, is not so clear. Many of these satires are approaching a Judaism that is real only by virtue of it existing in the collective imagination, which may or may not be terribly related to the really real Judaism that's being practiced in America. All stereotypes come from some kernel of truth, but though recognizable, they're also frequently to some degree false. Whether really real or only a simulacrum of reality, the subject or target of satire in this book is Jewish, or in many of the cases I'm discussing, Judaism itself. I should note, however, that although Jewish humor is a popular topic, the reality of that signifier is not universally accepted. Many people, including those who would know best, have claimed that Jewish humor is some sort of optical illusion. Mel Brooks, one of the cornerstones of American humor, Jewish or otherwise, once said, "You got it wrong. It's not really Jewish comedy. There are traces of it, but it's really New York comedy, urban comedy, street corner comedy. It's not Jewish comedy. That's from Vilna. That's Poland." Brooks sees Jewish comedy as something from over there, while over here, the humor is not Jewish. In the same vein, American studies scholar Alan Gutman claims there really is no such thing as Jewish humor because the Bible, the greatest of all Jewish books, is scarcely typified by elements of comedy. Gutman's argument against the designation is in part that if the term refers to some form of humor which has been characteristic of Jews from the time of Moses to the day of Moshe Dayan, then clearly the term has no referent at all. There is, on the other hand, a kind of humor which is common to the great Yiddish writers of the 19th century and to many Jewish American authors in the 20th century. This kind of humor is not, however, the result of Judaism as a religion and cannot be traced to the experience of biblical Jews. So the first part of his argument is clearly hyperbole, because if something has to be consistent from Moses to Moshe Dayan in order to be considered Jewish, then there is not, of course, a religion, culture, language, practice, or belief that could properly be called Jewish. More to the point is the end of his argument, in which he claims that this thing that we're calling Jewish humor is not the result of Judaism as a religion. Although Gutman does not define what he means by either Judaism or religion, in the context of his larger essay, it indicates that it's some sort of nexus of rituals, practices, life cycle events, and texts. Defining terms is the perpetual rabbit hole down which most academic discussions eventually fall, but Gutman's definition of religion seems largely practical, and that works for my purposes as well. In this book, I define religion as something that involves both beliefs and practices, and Judaism will be considered a religion using that definition. I prefer to use definitions of religion that sit somewhere between the classic functional reductionists like Durkheim and Freud and the cultural anthropologists like Geertz or Evans Pritchard. Religion has a role in social and cultural development, but I don't think that that's all to which we should properly reduce religion. My intent is not to limit what constitutes either religion or Judaism, but to have a stable understanding of the terms that's true to the way that satirists and critics alike are using them. Although I disagree with the way Gutman defines Judaism for his purpose of discrediting the concept of Jewish humor, he does highlight the difficulty that arises from the arbitrariness of labels. The separation of Jewish and American in the identity marker Jewish American is a tenuous thing. Both must exist in close to equal measure to make the label work. Ken Colton Frome asks, in what sense is material Jewish identity in America a specifically Jewish or American expression? And Shaul Magid asks a similar series of questions. How much America in American Judaism? How much Jewishness is in America? How much has Jewishness changed contemporary America? And how much has America changed? They're both circling around the same problem, which is trying to sort out what makes American Jewish identity distinct from, say, European Jewish identity or Israeli Jewish identity. That question is significant to a book like this one, as it is American Jewish humor under the microscope here. And I argue that in humor studies, it is vital not to conflate comedy from different language families, cultural settings, or national identities. So for us to be able to identify Jewish satire separated from the shared American immigration experience of many cultures, we have to isolate the aspects of it that could not exist without Judaism. American and Jewish identities have often battled in the lives of American Jews. Norman Lear once wrote, "America's homemade moral system of rational pragmatism does battle with a weaker but more ancient and durable adversary, traditional Judaism." American Jews have spent generations trying to bring these two adversaries to a peaceful resolution. The push-pull between Jewish and American is, in some ways, what lies at the heart of this project. And while I'm presenting things in terms of how different generations of Jews relate to their Judaism, it could just as easily be read as a study of the effects of Americanization. What I will not call it, however, is a study in American Jewish assimilation, because I strongly resist the idea that what we are seeing is anything as simple as assimilation. American Jews have not become American Protestants, regardless of how many elements of American Protestantism have worked their way into Jewish life and practice. American Judaism today may not look like American Judaism 150 years ago, but it has not disappeared, and I therefore refuse to see this as a story of assimilation. Resistance is not, it turns out, futile. So that's just a little bit of the introduction to the book to give you some flavor for it. So let's see, I see it's 7:32. So let me just briefly tell you a little bit about what the rest of the content of the book covers, and then we can just jump into some Q&A and questions, and I'd be happy to hear from the rest of you. So as I established in the introduction, the book is set up covering these 4 generations. So the silent generation, the baby boom, Generation X, and millennials. And the heart of the book is essentially a pendulum swing that goes from the silent generation to Generation X, and it bisects the baby boom in the middle. And then millennials are kind of off doing their own thing at the end of the book, which I can talk about in a minute. But what I discovered as I started to study this material is that there was a pretty consistent way that silent generation humorists treated Judaism, and it was relatively hostile. So I cover the first 2 chapters of the book cover figures from the silent generation. So the ones that I profile primarily are Joseph Heller, Bernard Malamud, Philip Roth, and Woody Allen. So to give you a sense of who the silent generation is, it's those guys. And Mel Brooks would also be silent generation. It's all of those folks. And what I found was a not surprising, based on the fact that this is material that was being published. The earliest thing I cover is Philip Roth's Goodbye Columbus, his first book that he put out. And that comes out in 1959. So most of the silent generation material I'm looking at is like 1960s, early 1970s. And so it's not surprising that what I found was a sort of counterculture lack of trust in authority, lack of trust in institutions, a sense of institutional religion, which includes institutional Judaism, as being a sort of empty, but also kind of dangerous force. The silent generation, born as they were in the interwar years, these are kids whose childhoods were colored by the Great Depression, and were colored for a lot of them by being aware of World War II, but they were for the most part too young to fight in World War II. The very oldest of the silent generation might have been old enough to fight. But for the most part, they didn't fight in either of the two world wars. But this is a generation who grew up in the progressive era in the United States in the 1930s, which is the period in American history of the most vocal, visible public anti-Semitism that we've ever had. This is when Henry Ford is publishing his Dearborn Independent and reprinting the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and when Charles Lindbergh is running for president on an American Nazi platform. Anti-Semitism in the United States in the 1930s was very, very visible in public. And then their later childhood is in the shadow of World War II, and the stories coming out of Europe and the Holocaust. So it's no surprise that this is a generation who really has a sense of existential fear for Jews, for the Jewish people, for Jewish peoplehood. What they don't think is the solution to that is religious orthodoxy, or heterodoxy, or heteropraxy, even orthopraxy. It's not the institutions of religion that are going to save the Jewish people. It's Jewish communal strength. It is the strength of the people. It is Jews looking out for other Jews. There's a real sense that Jews have to, in the material that I look at, there's a real sense that Jews have to look out for each other because nobody else is going to look out for them. But there's a real distrust of rabbis, of ritual, of synagogues, of practice in that way. When you then get to their grandkids, let's call them, in Gen X, you get an almost 180-degree inverse. What the Gen X material I look at demonstrates is these are films and TV shows and books and stories about terrible people, like just absolutely horrible people, selfish, narcissistic, dysfunctional families who will stab each other in the back and stab each other in the front, and just really nobody you would want to hang out with. But time after time, just at the moment where characters would become so unlikable that the audience would stop watching or the reader would put the book down, the writer will humanize the characters. And they do that over and over through engagement with Jewish ritual. So one of my favorite examples from the Gen X chapter is this book by Jonathan Tropper called This Is Where I Leave You. And it's about the Foxman family getting together to sit Shiva for the patriarch of the family who has just died at the beginning of the book. And like they're horrible to each other throughout the entire book. These siblings are just at each other's throat. They're ruining each other's marriages. They're destroying each other's lives. Like they're awful people. But there is a scene midway through the book where they go to synagogue to say Kaddish on Shabbos. They go to say Kaddish for their father. And the way that the first person protagonist narrator describes this sudden feeling of human connection between himself and the congregation and between himself and his family. And he talks about wishing he could stay in that moment of saying Kaddish with all of the congregation around him saying Kaddish with him as well. He wishes he could live in that moment for longer. And that is just one of multiple examples I found of the same phenomenon where Gen X writers use actual engagement with Judaism as a thing that keeps people grounded and a thing that makes them human and a thing that gives them depth and personality, so far from being the dangerous, empty, untrustworthy institution that it is for the silent generation. Religion is an important thing that keeps you from being a nihilistic, narcissistic monster. In the middle is the baby boom. And what I found is that the baby boom generation didn't really have much of its own identity. They smartly followed the economics of the day, and they followed trends. So baby boom humor that comes from the 1970s, 80s, and kind of into the 1990s, it looks like what came before it. It's a continuation of a lot of the same trends and themes, and it tends to have a lot of distrust and irreverence for ritual Judaism. And then those baby boomers who were able to make the transition into the 21st century, and I used the Coen brothers as an example of this with their film A Serious Man, they start to mimic some of the Gen X patterns. So like in A Serious Man, for example, the Coen brothers 2009 movie, everything is going terrible for this man throughout the course of the movie. But the one moment of hope in the whole movie is the scene of his son's bar mitzvah, where you see him and his estranged wife holding hands. The implication being that they might be able to resolve their marital differences. He has been on the verge of losing his job and not getting tenure. During the bar mitzvah scene, his boss from the university tells him he thinks he's going to have good news about his tenure case. So in this entire movie of suffering, the one time that he has hope and the one time that things look up are when they're sitting together as a family and engaging with their son's bar mitzvah ceremony. So the baby boom started out looking like the silent generation and then has ended up looking more like Generation X. And then in the final chapter of the book, I focus on millennial humor, and I mostly say it's a bit too early to know exactly what they're going to do over the course of their career. The very oldest millennials are just over 40. The youngest are still only about 25. So these are folks who are still really building their comedy careers. And so it'll remain to be seen what they do. But currently, based on the examples I look at from like Broad City and Crazy Ex-Girlfriend and some other millennial humor like that, what it looks like is that they're pulling together elements of both. They will use ritual when it suits them, and they will mock it when it suits them, and they don't have the sense of reverence for kind of either part, either the Jewish identity part or the Jewish ritual part. So that's the content of the book. That's the overview of the book. And now with our remaining 15, 20 minutes, I would love to hear from you all. Tell me your thoughts about Jewish humor. I'm happy to answer questions. As I say, tell me your favorite Jewish joke. The rest of the evening is yours. So feel free to unmute and jump in or raise your hand.
Thank you so much. I find this topic to be really fascinating. And while you were speaking and while you were reading some of your excerpts, I remembered that a few years ago, I happened to have been at the thrift store, and I came across this book called Jewish Jokes for the John. And it actually has, I don't know if you came across any of your research, but it actually has a little thing to hang it somewhere in the bathroom. And it has some of those gems like, what do you call a Jewish baby that's not circumcised? And the answer to the joke is a girl. So, has some of those things. But I just thought I would grab that. I was like, oh yeah, I forgot all about that book. But it was published in 1967. And as I picked it up and bought it because I thought, oh, this is only a couple dollars and it's interesting or whatever. But I will tell you that as I started going through this book published in 1967 and started reading it with my more, modern sensibilities, shall we say, I was like, this would never fly. I mean, this thing was so well loved that there was actually a piece of toilet paper marking where someone had read to, but it's still in here actually, which I think is hilarious. I've just left it because I thought it was so funny. Looks like it's that purple that green Charmin even, that you could only get in 1970s. Anyway, but my point is, as I was reading through this text and these jokes, I just was struck by, oh my gosh, like you would never say that now. It wouldn't even be considered, it's not even considered funny. And some of them I was physically uncomfortable as I was reading them. And so I was curious to, kind of kick off the Q&A. Because there is so much of the comedy world that is seems to be really inundated by really wonderful Jewish comedians. How did you decide who you were going to focus on for each individual generation? Because it seems like just the task to narrow that down would have been incredibly overwhelming.
It was. Yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you. And my reason for approaching the book the way that I did was sort of twofold. One, because all of my degrees are in religious studies, I was naturally inclined to focus on the religious aspect of this, and that was something that's missing from the existing literature on Jewish humor. But also, that did give me a good way to start to sort stuff. So Mel Brooks isn't in the book, in part out of respect for him, because if he doesn't think Jewish humor is real, I'm not going to stick him into my book on Jewish humor. That's rude. But there are sort of classic names that we might think of. Milton Berle is not really in here. Sid Caesar is not really in here, because the things that we point to with them when we talk about them, that being Jewish humor, that's when we get into those really like ineffable, hard to articulate qualities. Like it's a certain relationship to language. They have these kind of Yiddish inflected speech patterns, or they'll slip a Yiddish word in. It's a certain relationship to logic that denotes Jewish humor. Like all of that is interesting and engaging, and is in a lot of the existing literature on Jewish humor. And so I decided I was going to focus on the corner of it where these folks were writing about Torah, writing about Talmud, writing about circumcision, writing about, bar mitzvahs. And so that did actually help me to sort a lot of stuff out, because they simply don't do much with that.
That makes perfect sense. And I was just taking a second because I couldn't remember the name of the current it's on Netflix right now, and it has a lot of Jewish comedians in it. And I can't remember what the name of it is, of the name of the program. Maybe somebody else can help me out. It's only been on Netflix for a very short time. I think it has the lady who starred in Seinfeld and a couple of other. What is it, Elaine?
Oh, her name is Elaine. Julia Louis-Dreyfus.
Yeah, it has. She stars in it, and I can't remember what the name of this. What is it?
Well, they have Veep. That was a program that she was in a long time ago.
No, this is it's current on Netflix. Anyway, I'll have to find it, and I'll put it in the chat when I find it. But my point is, there's a whole scene where it's during Yom Kippur, and they're at the synagogue, and they're having, sort of this argument back and forth, and the mom is being, very, very, aggravated at the son, who is sort of way out there, and they're having this very uncomfortable exchange during services and what have you. And I only watch part of it because for myself personally, watching this, what was to be funny, contained within a religious service that I take very seriously, I did not find it funny. And I watched long enough to go to, when they're schmoozing afterwards at the Oneg, or, well, it must have been Rosh Hashanah, because they were having an Oneg, so it wouldn't be Yom Kippur. But, and they're having this very uncomfortable exchange with like the doctor and all this other stuff and these weird insinuations. And I remember thinking and I didn't continue watching it, because for me, it was taking something that I consider to be so sacred and taking it into a comedic realm that just didn't feel funny and didn't feel appropriate. So I kind of see where you're talking about, where the millennials generation is still kind of figuring things out. And there's a line that is definitely at times being pushed. And for me personally, I didn't find it funny, but that doesn't mean that other people didn't find, other people have said, oh, I thought it was great. It was hilarious. And so it was interesting.
I think is the show that you're.
Yes.
Yeah.
What was it?
Yeah. It's called You People.
That's it.
Oh, okay. Oh, all right.
Yeah. And it was kind of written and created by Jonah Hill. So precisely as you say, this is a very millennial sensibility where nothing is sacred anymore. Neither the identity part of it nor the tradition part of it.
Yeah, it's a great example of where everything is completely thrown out the window.
Yep.
For sure.
Yep, exactly.
So when you were doing your research, I don't mean to monopolize the questions, but I've been, thinking about this
Right.
topic for a while now. When you started this process and you started doing your research, what is one of the things that you really found that you were like, I did not expect to find that?
So one of one of the first like major eye-opening things I had was the short story Eli the Fanatic. If anybody's familiar with it, it's a Philip Roth short story. It's from his first collection from Goodbye Columbus. And I had kind of always had a sense of Philip Roth, like I think many people do. That, I had heard all of the criticisms of him as a self-hating Jew, and that he was bad for the Jews. And I had heard the story about how he got an angry letter from his rabbi in New Jersey after the publication of one of his early books, just talking about how dare you write these horrible Jewish characters? You are going to be responsible for the next Holocaust. I mean, just like the horrible things that people said to Philip Roth over the course of his career. And I had read Portnoy's Complaint and hated it. And I still hate Portnoy's Complaint. That is much like Catcher in the Rye. That is a book that I think is for adolescent boys, and I never was an adolescent boy, so that's okay. Not everything has to be for me. And that is not for me. And I had seen the movie of Goodbye Columbus. So like I was sort of, I felt like I was familiar with him and with his oeuvre. And then I read the other stories in the Goodbye Columbus collection. And I got to Eli the Fanatic, which is this story about this very acculturated town, suburban town, Westerville, I think it's called, Woodinton. That's what it is. It's Woodinton. And it's unclear if it's like Westchester County or if it's Connecticut, but it's clearly one of those New York bedroom communities. And they've just started letting Jews in. It's 1947. And the Jews of Woodinton have only been allowed to live there for like a couple of years. And they're all super conscientious about not stepping on the toes of their Protestant neighbors. They don't want to rock the boat. And then this yeshiva opens up in the town full of refugee children from the war. So there's this man who has opened up essentially a refugee children's home, and is running a yeshiva in Woodinton, and he has this other adult man who is helping him at the school, who is also a displaced person, a war refugee who doesn't really speak any English. And the course of the short story is all of the Jews of Woodinton trying to get Eli to go kick the yeshiva out of town, because they're all terrified that the Christians are going to like notice that there are Jews and freak out and kick them out. And Eli eventually having this weird religious experience where he exchanges suits with the adult refugee, and he puts on what's described as a basic sort of Hasidic garb, and goes out into town and has this like psychological breakdown where he recognizes the depth of his own emptiness, and putting on this religious garb gives him this like sense of enormous loss that he's missing in his life. And meanwhile, everybody else just thinks he's having a mental breakdown. And, because it's so impossible to them that a nice assimilated Jew like Eli would put on these clothes and would possibly have this religious experience. And so the story is just a scathing indictment of comfortable American Jewish communities' mistreatment of Eastern European refugees, mistreatment of Orthodox Jewish communities. It is nothing I expected to come from Philip Roth. At no point did I expect to read a defense of Orthodoxy coming from Philip Roth. So that was really one of the first like major eye-opening surprises that I had in it. It's a great story if you've never read it. It's a short story, so it's not that long.
Well, it sounds something like I would never, you're right. That's totally Not when you're thinking in this frame, and then all of a sudden you're like, throws you a curveball.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think Elaine has a question. Elaine, I saw you unmute. Go right ahead.
Well, what I remember growing up in the Ed Sullivan Show and Myron Cohn.
Yeah.
And to this day, I still like the idea of what he used to say as a kid. But I think my favorite Jewish comedian is Alan Sherman.
We just covered him in my Jewish humor class last week.
Oh,
We did.
really?
I did Alan Sherman, Mickey Katz, Tom Lehrer,
Yes.
and
Mhm.
Kinky Friedman together.
Oh, I love it. That's a great group.
Yeah. Yeah, I love Alan Sherman. And Alan Sherman's so interesting too, because he's one of those people where, of course, we mention him as one of the greats of Jewish comedy. And yet, when you listen to his music, very little of it has anything Jewish, anything
Right.
specifically Jewish about it at all. Helamata Helafata, unless you are really tuned into the relationship between Jews and summer camp,
Yes, right.
you don't necessarily understand why that would be considered Jewish humor. I made my students listen to Harvey and Sheila as well.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. That's a great
Right,
one.
because then at least you have, again, if you're not familiar with Hava Nagila as a musical motif, you don't
Yes.
understand why anything about this is Jewish. So
Right.
it's very coded.
Yeah. And I like that. I think
Yeah.
it's fun. It's really, I appreciate it.
Yep.
Like the inside joke on the inside joke.
Exactly.
Exactly. That's
You got it.
There's a name for that. It's called superiority humor.
Well, there we go.
It's
I
probably
never
when you
that.
laugh at something because you recognize that you're getting something that other parts of the audience aren't getting, and that makes you laugh even harder.
I had no idea that had an actual term.
Neither
See,
did
this is
I.
why we
Hey.
needed you.
Yes, we learned something new.
Absolutely. Well, if any of our other audience members would like to, we're a nice intimate group tonight. So if you have a question you would like for Jenny to answer for us, please feel free to go ahead and unmute, or if you have a comment. I know I have thoroughly enjoyed learning this. So feel free, you can go ahead and unmute, and you don't even have to have me call on you necessarily. You're more than welcome to ask away. But I think this is a really unique and interesting topic that you chose, and just interesting how you divided all these things up and really opened my eyes, because sometimes you just sort of laugh and you don't think about the implications of the laughter. I mean, we just had Purim, for Pete's sake. So
Right, exactly.
talk about things being upside down. Perfect
Right,
timing for you to be
exactly.
talking about funny
Yeah.
things.
Oh, and I did promise you. I promised you I
some-
would make a Michigan connection, but go ahead, Esther.
Yes, that's all right.
Okay. I'm sorry, I missed in the beginning. Are you from this area? Are you from Detroit area?
I'm not. I'm at the University of Cincinnati.
Okay, so you probably never heard of Danny Raskin, who's the late longtime columnist at the Jewish News.
No,
And-
and I'm not
and
from here
he-
originally either. So
And he always had old corny Jewish jokes in his column. And you said something about the baby boomers identify the humor of the generation in front of them. And I always liked that stuff. I mean, I didn't know a lot of the things he would talk about, but I enjoyed his, a lot of things about, the Henning Youngman kind of thing. Take my
Yeah.
wife, please. I don't know. I found humor in that,
a lot of people did.
I
A lot
did
of people
too.
did. Yeah.
but that's not my
What?
generation.
Right.
And I still say it.
And why does it never take my husband?
And it's always mother-in-law, not father-in-law.
Yeah, right,
We-
exactly.
We could have a whole nother conversation about that. That is a topic near and dear to my heart, but yeah, we don't have time for that. But with our last minute, yes, I promised I would make the Michigan connection, which is that there is a section in the book where I talk about the classic Saturday Night Live infomercial for Jewess Jeans, starring Gilda Radner, and she is a Detroit native.
Yeah,
She's a
definitely.
huge part of the changing representation of Jewish women in comedy. She was sort of one of the first Jewish comedian women to be unapologetically beautiful and and attractive, and not make jokes at her own physical expense. And so she was really important in kind of shifting that narrative. So grateful for her.
Love it. I love it. Well, we're always good to learn, fun to learn about other Jewish connections. And I was reminded while you were talking, as I was preparing to put together things for your program, I came across a cartoon, and I should have saved it, but I didn't. But I think I can just describe it real quick. But it was two starfish. One starfish looked like a normal starfish, and the other starfish was a six-pointed starfish. And the one looks to the other and he goes, "Harry, just because you look like that doesn't make you kosher."
That's good.
Nice.
Well, we want to thank you, and we have a way of applauding here at JHSM that is actually the international sign language way of applauding, where we do like this for you because you can't hear us applaud. So we're giving you a round of applause, and we so appreciate you joining us this evening. I know I learned a tremendous amount. It was a lot of fun, and I hope please, the one thing you haven't told us though is if people would like to, hopefully they would like to get your book, how do we go about that?
You can get it through Wayne State University Press. You can also go to bookshop.org, which will purchase it from a local bookstore, or you can buy it from your local intergalactic conglomerate that sells everything.
I love it.
Name,
I love how you
know
describe that. I'm
Yeah.
going to use that from now on. The intergalactic conglomerate. I love it.
There's always BookBeat.
Yes.
It's our independent place.
Yeah. Yeah.
Definitely.
Perfect. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you again for Jennifer Caplan for joining us this evening, for talking about her really wonderful book. Can't wait to do a little bit more of a deep dive into the topic myself. And I hope that you will potentially join us for one of our other upcoming programs. And thank you all so very much for being here. I appreciate it, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you all.